like counter-terrorism command and all the rest of it? Do we really just need a police force for London and put all the rest of it into some sort of specialist directorate?
Counter-terrorism police are investigating after a man was set on fire while walking home from a mosque in Birmingham. Officers are also considering whether last night's attack in Edgbaston is linked to another in West London last month. A man's been arrested. Gwyneth Paltrow has appeared in court in the US over claims she seriously injured a man in a hit-and-run skiing crash. A lawsuit claims the actress caused a brain injury in Utah in 2016. And 1,700 Just Eat drivers are set to lose their job. The takeaway company is moving to a self-employed model instead. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 132 points at 75.36. The pound buys $1.21 and €1.13. LBC weather, heavy rain moving eastwards across the UK tonight. Some sharp showers in western areas during the early hours with a low of 4. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Charlotte Morgan.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 2 minutes past 8 on LBC. Welcome to Tuesday's Cross Question. With me on the panel to my left is Liz Saville-Roberts, Plaid Cymru leader in Westminster and MP for Dwyfor Meirionnydd. And to her left, Andrew Griffith is Conservative Economic Secretary to the Treasury and MP for Arundel and South Downs. To my right, Camilla Turner, Chief Political Correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. And to her right, Mick Whelan, General Secretary of ASLEF, the union which represents train drivers. The number to call, we've cleared the switchboard, 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 and you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC, and do watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Welcome to you all. Let's go to our first caller. It's Gareth in Matlock. Hello, Gareth.
Good evening, Iain. Nice to speak to you.
Hi.
Lovely to be on. Yeah, that's great. So you want a question about this Boris Johnson affair?
Well, not necessarily about the Boris Johnson affair, whatever you'd like to ask.
Right, so I'll get straight to the point and succinct. So let the panel listen. I'd like to say, is there any chance that Boris gets a fair hearing tomorrow, or is it just a witch hunt by a political court?
Well, Camilla Turner, you have been watching this avidly, I imagine, as it's developed. What's your answer to Gareth?
Well, I mean, I think that is very much the argument from one side of the party, from Boris Johnson supporters. They say, how can this possibly be a fair situation? You've got Harriet Harman, the Labour MP, who's the chair of this committee, who's already on record as saying she thinks Boris Johnson is in the wrong before it even started. And one of the points he makes is, in what circumstance would you ever have a judge that has said before the court hearing begins whether the defendant is innocent or guilty? That would never happen in a judicial setting, so why should it happen in this Partygate hearing? So I think there'll be a lot of people in the party who perhaps were already supporters of Boris Johnson who would very much subscribe to that school of thought. But of course there'd be others who would say this is a cross-party group of MPs. They've all got their say. They've spent, I think it's 10 months now, considering all the evidence, and they'll do as best they can. It then goes to the vote of MPs.
And the Conservatives have a majority on this committee, a majority of one. But, I mean, should we be looking at who the 4 Conservative members are? Because they're not all people who you would describe as rabid Boris Johnson supporters, are they?
Yes, that's right. And of course, the Conservative MPs, even though they're on that committee, it's very much up to them how they decide to vote and what conclusion they come to. There has been, of course, a concerted effort by Boris Johnson supporters, members of the Conservative Party and sort of grassroots supporters who have been bombarding these MPs with letters and correspondence trying to tell them not to betray Boris Johnson. But of course, it's on them to make their view based on this 10-month-long hearing and all the evidence they've heard.
Liz Saville-Roberts, this committee, even though it has a majority of Conservative members on it, I mean, and it is effectively a select committee. MPs on select committees, they don't generally always toe the party line, do they? So, I mean, they will be looking at this, presumably, with an independent mind.
Well, I hope they are, because MPs are elected to Westminster as individuals. They happen to be members of parties then. being a member of a very small party, I know how that operates in the status of members of larger parties. But let's take a step back here. And this question, and I respect Gary's question because I know we're going to hear it from a lot of different directions, but this actually is out of the Trump playbook. And that is what Boris Johnson's 52 pages of evidence is playing along. And yet this is from the Prime Minister. Well, the idea that who is to set themselves up as to be his judge, that Parliament and the members of Parliament, let us remember that he campaigned for Brexit that was to bring back sovereignty, that sovereignty put into action is to be questioned and is to be undermined, in much the way that Boris Johnson has played out his entire political career of undermining the democratic institutions that uphold politics in the United Kingdom. This is just the latest manifestation of that. There is an irony, of course, that he's had over, £220,000 of public money to prepare this 52 pages of defence. But nonetheless, if we respect the democratic institutions of the United Kingdom as they stand and the way that we operate politics, this is the way that Westminster and the House of Commons expects conduct to be adjudged. And the Prime Minister is coming before that group of parliamentarians.
Ex-Prime Minister.
Yeah. In the Parliament, and the Prime Minister, the ex-Prime Minister, is coming before this group of parliamentarians to be adjudged in that respect.
But he's entitled to put his defence forward, isn't he? And that's what this document does.
His defence seems to be that other people who I was leading and was the boss of didn't tell me not to do it, and that I have insufficient political judgment as a leader to be able to assess whether the regulations and the guidance that I myself was the front face of actually applied to me. And that the way that he then addressed that in front of the House of Commons, with the advantage of the privilege of the House of Commons and the requirement on ministers to correct the record when they know they are incorrect, somehow or other,
which he has done
considerably later in the day. And if ministers do not hold to that, then the truth becomes a very mutable quality in the politics of the United Kingdom.
Andrew Griffith.
Well, obviously, Liz has made up her mind without having heard the evidence. Look, let me take it to a slightly different place.
I have read it.
You haven't heard the evidence that the cross-examination that the Select Committee is holding tomorrow. Let me take it to a slightly different place. Before I was elected, only 3 years ago, I was in business, and you very regularly ended up trying to adjudicate on employment matters, grievances, and matters of employment. And we were always taught you had to be astonishingly careful not to prejudge anything, right? You had to look at all of the evidence objectively, not partially, and that due process was incredibly important. And that is the case under English law. And if you didn't do that, then that wouldn't be upheld and any sanction thereafter. As a minister, you are told the issue is if you deliberately mislead. It's not a subjective test of what anyone else thinks. It's whether you deliberately mislead. So that's what was in your mind at the time. And it's incredibly common that ministers, either misspeak or, they give a figure and the source isn't quite right, and they go back, as Liz has said, and correct the record after the facts come to light. So I just think, we should, personally, I think we should treat this. I'm sure that all of my colleagues my parliamentary colleagues on the Select Committee have the utmost integrity. I mean, of course, but it's very important that the process is properly followed to reassure people like Gareth that it's done in the right way. This is a very serious matter. It is like an employment matter. Do you have any concerns that the goalposts seem to have changed over the months, where the original accusation was that Boris Johnson had deliberately lied to the House of Commons, and that seems to have changed now to whether he recklessly lied to the House of Commons? Well, those are slightly different things. They are slightly different things, and there's a lot of case law on that. As I understand it, unless some code has been updated, the test is still deliberately mislead. Mick Whelan.
Oh, I love coming to this debate last. Quite simply, I find it rather odd that somebody who doesn't want to be tried in the court of public opinion then releases his dossier to the court of public opinion to put pressure upon the people that are going to make the adjudication. Surely he would have been criticised. I don't know. Who asked him to release it? Who decided tactically it was the right thing to do? So what we do have is the ex-Prime Minister of this country who helped made the laws, who told people that they couldn't be with their families when they were dying, right, and stood up and asked us all to do various things for the greater good, who then in his own house, that greater good, we believe, wasn't being observed. Now, I believe what you believe. The test is tomorrow, based upon the evidence that's been gathered over that period of time for the people who I do trust their integrity, funnily enough, will make a decision on whatever's said tomorrow, whatever defence is made. I find it rather awkward, having written disciplinary policies and being on the other side of the table to businessmen such as yourself, where we've agreed disciplinary policies, that somebody would put their defence into the public domain before we've had a chance to sit down and look at it in a reasonable and measured way without the pressures coming from all sorts of sides. Now,
but what would you say if one of your members was in front of a disciplinary and somebody who was on that disciplinary panel had publicly said something about that case? What would your advice to your member be in that situation? Would you be confident
I would use that leverage
in
the hearing itself, quite naturally, but also at the same time, there is all the fact that there's a charge, there is a decision being made as something to answer. So already in the court of whatever you're calling it, right, there is already a decision being made that something's got to be challenged. What were the behaviours? Were the behaviours appropriate? Were in the line of what was a right time? And, you know, forgive me for this, and you expect me to say it coming from my background, is that fact checks on most of Boris' speeches, there was an awful lot of anomalies, an awful lot of things that turned out not to be quite accurate. And the history of Boris not quite getting things right, either through his persona or deliberately doing it and not correcting it later, is going to be attributed to what some of the stuff that's gone on.
Camilla, can you shed any light on this? About why is he making this document public? Did the committee ask him to do that?
Yes, I would just say on that point, it was actually the Privileges Committee that published the document. Boris Johnson was set a deadline of submitting it earlier. Yesterday was the deadline, and then today the document's published by the Privileges Committee ahead of the hearing tomorrow. So that wasn't a decision that was in his hands. But of course, what we do know is that Boris Johnson has been calling for all the evidence to be published. He says he's got nothing to hide. His team feel that the committee have sort of cherry-picked the evidence that's been put into the public domain so far. He even says in his evidence that photographs have been weaponised by the committee. So in his view, he'd rather have all the evidence out there in the public domain for everyone to see, and he believes this will actually help his case, and wants the committee to do that.
And what happens once the committee has made its findings, and this is going to be, I think, in the middle of May, they recommend to the whole House of Commons that he should be punished in a particular way, do they? And then all MPs get a vote on that?
That's right. So depending on the severity of the punishment that the committee recommends, if they do go for the kind of worst case scenario for Boris Johnson, which is recommending that he is suspended as an MP, triggering a recall petition, that then goes to the House of Commons. Downing Street have already said this is going to be a free vote, so Tory MPs as well as all the other MPs can vote how they like, and then ultimately it's up to the MPs to decide whether that sanction is implemented or not.
Well, I suppose we shouldn't really speculate on what the outcome of that might be, but I mean, it's going to be very difficult for the committee. I mean, if they come to the conclusion that he did deliberately lie and has no real contrition about it at all, despite the fact that he's admitted that he did something wrong, it's going to be quite something for some Conservative MPs to have to decide what to do there. I mean, we could find a lot of pressure being put on them by their associations, and that could have all sorts of consequences.
Absolutely, and at the moment it's quite a testing time for MPs. We've got the boundary changes, we've got the ahead of the next election, the selections for MPs. We've already heard some instances of MPs potentially not being selected by their local associations because they're so annoyed that they were part of the Bring Down Boris brigade. So there's all sorts of pressures on these MPs, and ultimately it's a free vote, so they can't even rely on saying, well, I just did what I was told to.
Particularly related to this case, Andrew, but I mean, as a constituency MP, how much pressure does your association bring to bear on you to behave or to vote in a particular way or take a policy stance on a particular way?
I think it's more your constituents. I mean, we're all constantly getting emails. If we're diligent, we're out there talking to our constituents. And that's often the most sobering thing is those that haven't perhaps emailed many times on particular issues, but you're talking to in Arundel High Street, or they'll come up to you and they'll be concerned about a particular issue. I don't think that's particularly new, in fairness.
But constituency parties do have the power to deselect MPs. I mean, it doesn't matter what the party is, whether it's Labour, Conservative, Plaid, Cymru. I mean, I don't know what your procedures are, Liz. But as Camilla has said, there have been examples in the past few weeks where it is thought that one or two Conservative MPs have been deselected because they weren't supportive of Boris Johnson in the past.
Well, look, I've seen some reports. I'm not that close to it. I'm blessed with quite an active association, and I think when you've got a good, often quite a high volume of people, then perhaps it's more representative. You've seen some examples where associations are quite small. There's relatively few members, and then I think it's quite hard to put correlation as to what's been going on. There's always other factors, I suspect.
I think we should move on to a different subject, which we will do in just a moment. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC.
You're listening to Cross Question on LBC. Hope you're watching us on Global Player as well. We have Andrew Griffith with us, Treasury Minister, Mick Whelan from ASLEF, Liz Saville Roberts from Plaid Cymru, and Camilla Turner from the Telegraph. Let's go to, the big news story of the day. It's a text question from Richard in Leeds, who says, would the panel support positive discrimination as one of the tools for the Met Commissioner to use to break the institutional racism, sexism and homophobia within the force? Let's also broaden that out a little bit, because the Commissioner doesn't seem to accept that there is institutional racism, sexism and homophobia within the force. And I wonder if he doesn't recognise that, how he's in a position to really make huge changes. Andrew, let's start with you.
Yeah, I didn't catch all of the statement, but that which I did, I mean, there's clearly some real issues of culture and leadership, which is hugely disappointing given how long,
going back decades.
Yeah, how long this has been surfaced as an issue. I'm a fan of Mark Rowley. I think he's new. He came to this with a fresh, unencumbered background. I've liked the way he's focused on trust, on sort of back to basics almost, the core policing role, and he's set his expectations of very high standards. There's clearly a big job of change to be done. And as I understand it, ultimately all options have to be there. So I think it's terrible what we've heard. There's other reviews. The Angelini review is going on as well about the Sarah Everard affair. Huge job of work to do. What we should do is give Mark the chance to get in and fix that. He is fresh. It's really important to understand this didn't happen.
But he's got a background within the Metropolitan Police. I wonder whether it might be better if... I've got no axe to grind here at all. He may well be the finest public servant ever born, but... he does come from that background, doesn't he? And I wonder whether it might need somebody with a sort of fresh eye to really bring about dramatic change.
Well, I mean, I'll defer to others. I mean, my sense was he'd been out of the force for a long time. He'd been in different high-performing parts of the police. Sometimes this isn't a defence, so sometimes you have to, know how an organisation works as well to lead it on a journey that's very clearly, a significant journey from the place it is today. We shouldn't, because it of course, I'm sure everyone feels the same, but, police put themselves in harm's way. Nothing, although there are clearly deep-seated cultural issues, I don't want to diminish those for 1 second. There's nothing that we saw either that says the vast majority of serving officers aren't decent people trying to do the right thing in a very difficult job, possibly in a difficult environment that doesn't help them do that job.
So Mark retired from the Met in March 2018, I'm told, and rejoined it as Commissioner in September 2022. So he had 4.5 years out, but obviously steeped in the history of it. I suppose that was the point that I was trying to make. Camilla, a massive story, the Casey report. Now, Louise Casey, for those of us who know, I mean, she doesn't leave a stone unturned, and this isn't one of those reports where it's sort of seems to have been written by a member of the establishment. I mean, she really has gone for it in the conclusions, even suggesting that it might have to be broken up. Where do you think this is going to go? Because the Home Secretary's statement in the Commons this afternoon, I thought was possibly not as endorsing of some of her conclusions as it might have been.
I think it's an interesting one because from the government's point of view, they're very keen to say, well, a lot of these problems were under Cressida Dick. She's now out. We've now got Mark Rowley in, and isn't he wonderful? And he's going to tackle all these problems head on. But as you say, it's very interesting that he says he accepts the recommendations, but then he doesn't accept that the kind of crucial one, that the Met is institutionally racist, sexist, and everything else. I mean, it's sort of semantics. He's saying, oh, no one knows what institutionally means. But either way, you either accept recommendations wholeheartedly or you don't. And I think in order to make the massive changes that the Met Police clearly need, which this report highlighted, you do really need to accept it all as the first port of call before you can get on and do anything. I think the recommendation that the Met Police has broken up, I think we're quite unlikely to see happen. It's not something that Mark Rowley's particularly keen on himself. I think it's a massive kind of structural thing. I think it's probably one step too far. But I do think if he wants to sort of stay in his position and maintain that confidence that government ministers currently have in him, he will need to show that he's willing to do something quite radical to overcome all these problems.
Nick?
I'm quite terrified by the report, if I'm honest. I've met Doreen Lawrence, and we don't seem to have moved on since those times. But what I did pick up from most of it was the lack of due diligence in who we recruit. So one of the allegations is there's 100 serving officers that have got sexual offences. Now, in light of what's happened recently with Sarah Everard and whatever, that terrifies me in many ways. So was there an over-reliance on, I don't know, how people were recruited and the lack of due diligence that should go with that? And shouldn't the highest standards be applied? That doesn't mean whether it's positive discrimination or not, which is part of the question we haven't answered. The real question here is we should be recruiting the right people of the right standard, the right calibre to protect our families, protect our communities, whether it be in London or anywhere else.
And the thing is, we've all assumed that was happening.
But this report quite clearly says that wasn't happening. Now, if you've been in frontline policing in the last 4, 5, 10 years, we've had terrorist attacks, we've had many other things. I think at the top level of policing, you would have been concentrating on protecting people from those major issues which the government has dealt with, the police has dealt with, and other things. But then what happens in the structures behind isn't supporting what's going on the front line. And I think the frontline police force should be of the highest standard in whatever way we have to do it going forward to make that happen.
Saville Roberts, let's broaden this out as well, because it's not just the Met that has these problems. There are 43 different police forces in England. You have one in Wales, one in Scotland. I mean, reading some of the conclusions of Louise Casey's report today, does that sort of strike a chord with you in Wales as well?
Well, I know that the Chief Constable of North Wales Police, Amanda Blakeman, who came in fairly recently from Gwent, where there'd been issues in Gwent, and she took the initiative in publishing the figures that she had of police officers who were being investigated for domestic violence and gender-related violence, and they were a very small number, but I welcome the fact that she took this initiative. Nonetheless, I think the questions that have been faced by the Met are being faced by forces across the United Kingdom. And I think what you're seeing within the change that's been brought, the Tory government in its various manifestations since 2010, we lost 10,000 police officers. We have gained police officers in the meantime. There's a similar pattern, by the way, with prison officers as well. But there is an effect of losing experienced officers and corporate memory and corporate wisdom. And then in bringing in new officers, we've seen this in HMP Berwyn and Wrexham, where there's been a number of prison officers there, some of them have been imprisoned for having affairs with prisoners there. So the question about what needs to be done, I think one of the questions here is about positive discrimination. Yes, I think that is one of the tools, and we're looking at who the candidates will be for the future. But there are a whole host of other tools that really need to be grasped. And I must admit that the Home Secretary today was doing her best to avoid any responsibility and playing a political game which was inappropriate under the circumstances with blaming the Mayor of London when, in all honesty, there was responsibility in both
we've
ways.
Actually got a follow-up text on that from Andy in London. Says, should Sadiq Khan, as Mayor of London and the city's Police and Crime Commissioner, accept some blame for the Metropolitan Police's failings? Well, the logic of that is that, well, if he needs to accept some, then previous mayors of London need to accept some too, because this hasn't just happened over the last few years, has it?
Quite possibly, and in the heel of the hunt, the Home Secretary actually sets the expectations for how the police operate, which is one of the arguments, of course, that I will be putting forward when we have a different Parliament in Wales operating with a different set of values, that Welsh policing should have been devolved when devolution was first thought of, rather than having this anomaly in Wales where we have policing run from Westminster here with the priorities of mostly highly urban areas in England then being put into effect and the reduced funding associated with that put into effect in Wales. But that's actually making it work more effectively.
So Welsh policing does not come under the control of the Welsh Parliament?
No.
Because
isn't that extraordinary?
Well, I'm just now thinking, does it in Scotland? I think it does, doesn't it?
It does, yes.
So why the difference?
Because justice hasn't been devolved in Wales, and though we have a parliament that is in charge of housing, of education, of health, justice is not devolved. And though the Silk report recommended that it was turned down by Labour, although Labour in Wales now are asking for it. And of course, whenever I ask for it here, although we have this anomaly that we have a legislature in Wales, we don't have our own jurisdiction.
Andrew Griffith, just on that bit about Sadiq Khan, I mean, do you think that is a fair charge?
Look, I think we all know that the Metropolitan Police has a different structure to any other force in the UK because of its combination of national and local responsibility. So I'm not really into sort of pointing fingers. I think what we've learned today is that there's a really serious issue. That issue's been going on for a really long period of time, and a huge amount of cultural change needs to happen. It needs to happen really quickly because it's utterly wrong that communities feel discriminated against. The police are losing trust amongst different communities. And they do an incredibly important job for all of us. So this is something that is highly salient. So I don't want to point fingers, but I do acknowledge that everybody involved in this needs to work together to try and, in my view, give Sir Mark the support he needs to make change happen at pace. And we're all entitled to be pretty credulous on that, given that we've heard a lot of talk in the past about the Met changing its culture.
Mick, the whole issue of trust here is so important, isn't it? And when you have a report like this and various other reports over the last few years, inevitably trust is eroded in the police. But what we've got to remember is, I mean, people use the phrase bad apples, but there do seem to be more bad apples than just the odd one in the Metropolitan Police at the moment. But on a day-to-day basis, we've still surely got to have confidence in the police, in their ability to do their job.
In a lot of the communities I talk to in London, around the depots in which my people work in, that is seriously being damaged, particularly in the BAME community. And we've seen the figures, stop and search, and how they feel they're being under constant attack. And we've seen a series of reports on that. We've seen the misogyny that's been quite open. The high-profile case of the police rapist, who many of his colleagues called him by that name, who committed so many awful atrocities to women over a period of time and got away with it because he's a police officer. And this report on top of that, it'll take an awful lot to turn that round.
Does it also make you think, well, look, maybe in all sectors there are these people that have got away with it for a long time? Does it sort of, I mean, it's more for, I suppose, the railways management than you, but I mean, do you say to your members, look, if you see any evidence of this, you've got to report it?
Yes, we do. Look, we've just done a massive internal, spent a year on sexual harassment, about how to report it, how to change it. We're not perfect as an organisation, our industry isn't perfect, and we're reflective of the communities in which we live in and elsewhere. All you do is seek to improve and educate and then drive by example. Now, the big example, unfortunately, should be our police force. And at this moment in time, the best and biggest example to our kids and to our communities has lost the trust of our children and our communities, and that has to come back.
Nick, thank you very much for that. We'll move on with some more of your questions on some different subjects in just a moment. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask our panel a question. You're listening to LBC. It's 8:32. Let's get the news headlines with Charlotte Morgan.
The Home Secretary insists the Metropolitan Police Service will be supported to deliver more trust, less crime and higher standards, following a damning report into its culture. Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley's admitted being embarrassed and concerned by its findings. Counter-terrorism police are investigating after a man was set on fire while walking home from a mosque in Birmingham. Officers are also considering whether last night's attack in Edgbaston is linked to another in London last month. Gwyneth Paltrow has appeared in court in the US, accused of seriously injuring a man in a hit-and-run skiing crash. A lawsuit claims the actress caused a brain injury in Utah in 2016. LBC weather, heavy rain moving eastwards across the UK overnight. Some sharp showers for western areas during the early hours, with a low of 4.
LBC.
If you just tuned in, we have with us Conservative Treasury Minister Andrew Griffith, Mick Whelan, General Secretary of ASLEF. I don't know, you might like to be called leader, I don't know. But
it's better than Baron.
Well, that's to come. Liz Saville Roberts from Plaid, Cymru, and Camilla Turner from the Daily Telegraph. Right, next question comes from Hassan in Cambridge. Hassan, hello, what would you like to ask?
Hi, Ian. So my question is, China has come up with a peace plan. Secretary Blinken and a lot of Western press and governments have dismissed that. I believe this war has to be resolved through peace rather than a military solution. So why doesn't the UK and the US come up with an alternative peace plan?
I was desperate to answer that question myself, but I'm going to resist the temptation. Liz Saville Roberts.
I think, taking the step back, it's worth wondering whether Putin is looking at China and the relations with China as a way of avoiding the Western sanctions. And in that case, we've really got to look at how non-aligned countries are eroding the power of the sanctions that the West has put forward. So the concern then is whether Xi Jinping's visit, whether he validates Russia's standpoint, and although we can refer to a 12-point plan on behalf of China, will that result in a specific call for Russia to cease to act as the aggressor? Because otherwise it can be a distraction from what I think that, in all honesty, one would expect anybody who is looking towards a route towards peace, while Russia is legitimately perceived as being the aggressor. How are we going to get there is a fair question.
Mick Whelan.
I had the unique privilege of being in Ukraine and meeting various ministers and the free trade unions and the former trade union movement, and all they want is the right to self-determination. They want the right to be independent. And before we start talking about third-party peace plans, has anybody actually asked Ukrainians what they would like and whether they feel secure that if that was resolved, how it would be protected? So my initial view of this, was not having seen it properly, so it's hard to comment, was that the main party involved in this, the party that was invaded and attacked. And at some point, the party that's been invaded and attacked has to be one of the sole people that decides, right, where we go with this for the security of the world and security of that region.
And that's exactly the answer that I would have given. Andrew?
Not a great deal to add to that, in truth. I mean, it was, we're going to take this back. This was an act of unprovoked aggression. And if Russia wants peace, then there's an immediate way for them to achieve that, which is to remove their troops from an ally-friendly democratic country.
There will be a point, though, where there will be huge pressure for there to be some sort of peace deal, because, I mean, all conflicts end with some sort of negotiation.
Yeah, and that is for the Ukrainian.
It's very rare that there's a sort of unconditional surrender agreement. But, I mean, can you imagine what that might look like?
Well, no, I mean, I agree with Mick. I mean, that's for the Ukrainian people, that's for Vladimir Zelensky and his leadership team to determine.
Camilla?
Yeah, again, absolutely agree with Mick. I think, Ukraine's won a lot of support from the UK and other Western allies in helping it fight against Russia's unprovoked attack. And that support isn't and shouldn't be in any way conditional on what the outcome will be. It should be completely up to Ukraine to decide if it wants to negotiate a peace deal, and if so, on what terms. And I think it wouldn't be appropriate for other Western nations to put pressure on Ukraine or to start dictating the terms of any kind of settlement, because this whole war was fought over Ukraine's sense of self-determination and nationhood. So it should be for Ukraine to decide on what terms it wants to end.
Well, 13 years ago it was I agree with Nick. Now it seems to be I agree with Mick. So well done, Mick, for getting both myself and Andrew and Camilla on your side. Liz, would you subscribe to what Mick said?
I think that any peace deal that didn't involve Ukraine would be patently not worth even the paper that somebody proposed it on.
Right, let's move on to Irene in Stafford, who has a text question. Have the train staff who are still going on strike next week got a responsibility to accept a pay deal and get back to work? Now many of the other union disputes have seemingly been settled. Now we should point out that this is the RMT members who work for train operating companies are set to walk out again on 2 days next week, Thursday and Saturday, meaning that many train services across the country will not run. RMT members employed by the state-owned network Rail have now voted to accept a new pay deal, but train drivers in ASLEF, mixed union, have not settled their dispute but have not planned any further strike action while talks are ongoing. Is there any bit of that that's wrong, Mick?
Nothing's wrong with that, and trouble is the word obligation. The right deal on the right circumstances acceptable to the people that actually have to do the work for those terms and conditions for that remuneration. That is the key point in any trade union. So, it isn't trade union leaders that want to go out and strike. We only articulate the views and the voices of the people we represent. And, we didn't create this dispute, and I'm not going to go massively on the tack on the panel and explain the history of this today, but 4 years without a pay rise after being key workers and doing what we thought was our duty during the pandemic, we expected a degree of dignity coming out of it, and we found out that our employers have done a rather corrupt and dodgy deal with the government not to offer us a pay rise where we've got free collective bargaining. Now, it's taken a long time to step back from that process, but it will be the members of the RMT, when the appropriate deal is made and offered, that will then recommend or not recommend that deal to their members, and their members will decide. That's how democratic organisations work.
Andrew Griffith, the accusation is that the government are putting a block on this, first of all by telling the Department of Transport that they were not to enter into negotiations with the various unions, and then not providing any funding to settle the dispute. Where do you see this from your point of view, having heard what Mick said?
Look, it's important everybody is around the table. The government's willing to negotiate, but in this sector, I mean, there's many different sectoral conversations that are going on, and we've seen settlements, as you know, in the health workers over the weekend. But my understanding is in this sector, we've already seen the RMT settle. 76% of their members voted for an offer when it was put to them. The TSSA have also reached agreement with the government. So, respect Mick's duty and right to do right by his members. There's nothing wrong with that. But I would urge him to engage strongly. And when there is an offer, the offer, I think, for most of these deals was about 9% over 2 years, to put that to his members and give them, as well as the travelling public, the ability to get back to work. I mean, the context of this is the biggest challenge we all face as an economy, and I know it sounds a bit dry, but it is what is putting people's prices up and squeezing their standard of living is inflation, and it's hard sometimes being the responsible government that's making these difficult choices, but it's doing that not for its benefit, but because reducing inflation is going to be the number one way that we can help everybody in the country with the cost of living crisis.
The top 350 FTSE companies in the UK made 89% profitability. We've just seen the government waste £9 billion trying to get 100 doctors back to work by lifting the thresholds on pensions. I won't even go into the Liz Truss and Kwarteng weekend, which cost us £74 billion. Much of that could resolve many of the public sector disputes, and, may I make the point, the private sector dispute that we're involved in. I think if there's a willingness, there's a way. The way this has been conducted serially in the last 12 months until recently, has been a change of tone recently, and I have to be fair.
What do you put that down to?
Well, I did have 3 transport ministers in a month. The most recent transport minister has made an effort to engage with the rail minister, trying to facilitate the talks, and I do not mislead people. And that means when we've gone back into talks after, the offer referred to wasn't an offer. It wasn't negotiated, wasn't discussed around the table, and it went out to the press 15 minutes before it went out to my people in their companies. And it contained about 200 red lines that we'd already said no to. So I think someone was setting up to fail in the first place, but that can't have been done without the Treasury and or the government saying yes to the figures that were contained within it. Now, I could call it dishonourable, I could call it deceitful, I could call it disingenuous. I think what it did do was allow the dialogue to reopen in an adult and better way, and I'm hoping we're going to then move on from this and find a solution that's equitable to all.
Do you feel that you are nearer a solution than you were?
I think we're in a different place, and the talks are in a more forthright place than they were previously, which was more about imposition rather than it was about agreement.
Very briefly, if I can, Camilla first, where do you see this going?
Well, I think the government's tactic has essentially been a sort of, engage in talks, but also stall and delay as much as possible, a sort of attrition tactic, because it's been going on for months now. Particularly the train disputes, they date back to sort of some point mid of last year. So we have seen some breakthroughs recently, and with some of the health unions. So perhaps you could see that as the government's sort of delaying tactic, and then eventually bearing some fruit with some of these talks. But ultimately, the longer these strikes go on, and the longer people can't catch a train, they can't get their kids to school, they can't get a doctor's appointment, it's not a good look for the government if you can't get your public services running.
Well, Liz, do you think that this shows that personality in politics is important? You've got two quite emollient figures now, Jeremy Hunt at the Treasury and Mark Harper at the Department of Transport, and language matters here.
Yeah, language matters, personality matters, but we're actually in one of the most unequal nations of the Western world. We know that Brits on average earn 60% of what the average American earns. We know that since COVID, there is 1/5 increase in the billionaires in this country. This is where the government's priority lies. Now, I am fed up with hearing that it's the pandemic's fault, that it's the war in Ukraine's fault. For some reason or other, it's not Brexit's fault, although we know that that's also hit us in terms of trade and in terms of productivity. But this government has been very, very comfortable in driving the inequality of the United Kingdom. Now, I stand with all the unions that are asking for a decent wage, because why should working people tolerate this lie that inequality somehow raises all our boats? It doesn't. And that's what offends me about this question about personality politics and about words. No, that's not what matters here. It's actually the decisions that are made in the budget, follow the money, who is allowed to be funded at a time when we desperately need people to get back moving on trains. We need to encourage people out of their cars, part of the route to net zero, and to recognise that unless we actually fund our public services, including our transport properly, we are doing that ineffectively. Let us actually stand back and look at what politics is about. It's not a game of entertainment, even if it's given Boris Johnson a very good career so far.
And we do stand back and look at what it's about. We'll find that inequality is not increasing. Inequality measured by the Gini coefficient is actually reducing. And if you look at where the government's putting its actions, not its words, where it's spending money, 94 billion to protect households, to protect the most vulnerable households. That's what the government was doing in the budget. That's what the government has been doing since COVID. You can't just, I'm afraid, Liz, just walk past the fact that we've been in an unprecedented period of human history, and the government has spent nigh on £400 billion that no government had in any forecast, and that's in common with seeing the same things as a general strike. There's a general.
Oh, no, let's not get started on Brexit. Let's not really.
There's a general strike
because we're about to go to a break and we haven't got time.
There's a general strike in France this week, and last time I looked, France was still inside the European Union.
Just before we go to a break, you collectively in the Treasury, the Chancellor announced last week in the budget that you were going to give a pensions break to the top 1%, which will cost quite a few £1 billion, as Mick pointed out earlier. Now, there are all sorts of reasons that you made that decision, I'm sure, but those are billions of pounds that you can't use to help people at the bottom because you've chosen to give a tax break to people at the top.
Well, we're not giving a tax break. What we're doing is allowing public servants, often senior public servants. We talked earlier in the context of the Metropolitan Police. Liz herself raised the issue of losing some of the institutional memory because senior serving officers were potentially retiring. The BMA was very, very clear, has been for a long time. So clear that they convinced the Labour Shadow Health Secretary that it was absolutely imperative to remove this arbitrary cap on people's pensions. The UK had a fantastic private pension provision for most workers in this country, and that helps everybody. Because the more that people save and can provide for their own retirement, the more that the limited funds that any state will only ever have are able to be deployed on the most vulnerable. So we have a great pension system. And what that removal of the cap was about was keeping doctors in service for longer, prison governors, airline pilots, air traffic controllers, precisely the sort of...
Okay.
Well, there's still public service.
Mick is desperate to come in as well as you, Liz, but we are going to have to go to a break. Otherwise, we're going to have a break and then the end of the programme. It's 10 to 9.
LBC
some challenging questions tonight on the programme. Here's another one from Richard in Gateshead. Hello, Richard.
Hi, Ian. How are you?
Very well, thank you. What would you like to ask?
My question to the panel is, should this government, who has already spent £60 million and counting, and the counting will be a lot, just to send the maximum, and I will repeat the word maximum, 200 people to Rwanda for our brave men's dream? Now,
well, I think on her visit to Rwanda, Suella Braverman said there could be thousands of people that go to Rwanda in the end, but I think the capacity at the moment, you're right, is about 200. So, Andrew Griffith, let's come to you first. Is this not a waste of money?
Well, it's a huge issue that we and most Western societies are having to deal with. Lots of people, understandably, are seeking a better life, but that's not the system that we ended up with following the UN Refugee Charter in 1951. So that piece of humanitarian architecture isn't fit for purpose. We want to open up safe and legal routes. The UK has an incredibly proud history culturally of welcoming people to this country, and we're really leaning into that just with Ukraine and Hong Kong and Afghanistan refugees. Your caller talked about the cost so far of getting Rwanda up and running. Of course, that's with the courts. We expect that to come through the courts in due course. But the biggest cost that we're facing as a country is the £6 million a day of accommodating people who've come here. And remember, mostly from safe countries. France, last time I looked, was a really safe country.
Right,
they've got their own refugee
Let's stick to Rwanda because we've only got a few minutes left. The point is that if this is meant to be a deterrent, how is it a deterrent when only 200 people will be going there? And as Suella Braverman described Rwanda over the weekend quite correctly as a beautiful country.
It's a very beautiful, very progressive country. If you looked at the BBC website a while ago, it was talking about how it was, one of the jewels in the crown of Africa. I think it's got more female members of parliament than the UK has. The key issue is it's obviously going through the courts. It's quite right, and it's part of the corpus of human rights law that the court is looking and making sure that the evaluation of Rwanda as a safe country was done correctly. I believe that is the case. And so it's premature to be judging the success of that strategy. What we need to look at is when that's up and running. And the deal, I'm reassured, is uncapped. But as you said, the real impact of that is one of a number of ways of dealing with this really big issue that we've got to face up.
Liz is about to explode.
I'm not going to explode. No. I'm going to comment with measured consideration. I think if we're assessing the human rights record of Rwanda, it might be worth asking some of their neighbours, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, who have to deal with refugees from Rwanda. But nonetheless,
the EU itself sent refugees to Rwanda. So the EU itself has a scheme to repatriate to Rwanda. £60 million
so
you were in favour of the EU earlier.
Being spent on an optic in an ineffective way that this government, which bear in mind has been in power since, I think, when we last looked, 2010, and the number of migrants have not decreased during that time. They have increased. We do not have safe routes into this country. What we're talking about here with the Home Secretary is trying to placate your backbenchers and some of the membership and demonising migrants at a time when the responsibility of this government and their record should be held to account in other ways.
Mick?
I agree with Liz on many levels. I think I met with a group called Rainbow Migration, and they're terrified of anybody who's gay being sent to Rwanda, being tortured and treated badly. I walked past the Kinder children's statue in Liverpool Street yesterday, and I thought, would they have been sent to Rwanda under the current climate? And bearing in mind, we took the minimum amount of Jewish people we could back at that moment in time of our history. We weren't very good back then. And it does terrify me that I don't understand what the legal route into this country is. Now, bearing in mind our proportionate responsibility for Afghanistan and many other places we've been in, I don't want illegal immigrants finding or economic immigrants coming in through the back door, but I do believe there has to be a channel for legal immigration into the UK, and we have to be able to do it in a proper manner. And just funneling people to a third-party country where they've got no right to come back from when they've been through the most atrocious journeys to get here, I can't see any natural justice in that. when we've been part of the problem elsewhere.
Camilla.
I think what I would say is, just in response to what you were saying earlier, I don't think this is a problem that's only significant for Tory backbenchers and some grassroots Conservative members. I think there are people up and down the country who are really concerned about the scale of the immigration that we have here, the small boats issue, the taxpayer having to foot the bill for all these hotels, the fact that we don't really have a workable solution at the moment to this problem. And I think it's very telling that Labour don't want to criticise the Rwandan deal on the basis of compassion or humanitarian grounds. All they want to say is it's unworkable, it's expensive, and that's because they know that the voters they're trying to appeal to in the next election, those in red wall seats as well as elsewhere around the country, are really concerned about this. And really, I think it's on Labour to try and come up with a policy that actually captures people's attention. This Rwandan policy obviously is meant as a deterrent, hasn't yet worked in reality yet, but at least it's something the government can say, here's our big bold pledge to tackle this problem.
Right, let's go to our final fun text question, and tonight it's from my esteemed producer Corey, who says, since Iain and I simply had to have a deep-fried Mars bar after last night's show in Glasgow, what's your guilty pleasure which you just have to have from a takeaway restaurant on a night out? I should explain that after the show last night, no restaurants were open, and we discovered the Blue Lagoon fish and chip shop in Glasgow. What a find that was, I'll tell you. And we did partake. In fact, Corey had some deep-fried haggis as well, but I drew a line at that. Andrew Griffith, what's your guilty pleasure in a...
Well, my wife is Scottish, and so I have also partaken in a deep-fried Mars bar. I would advocate a deep-fried Toblerone as an upgrade next time, and accompanied by cheesy chips.
Oh, goodness me. Liz?
Fish and chip shop in Barmouth does scallops, which are deep-fried slices of potato dipped in flour and then fried again, and they're brilliant.
Oh, that sounds more like my Mick.
My favourite in the Blue Lagoon, I've been there many times, is the smoked sausage and chips, but my guilty pleasure is probably a kebab.
Kebab. Not keen. Camilla?
I've got to say it's cheesy chips, but also with baked beans as well.
Oh, dear, oh dear. What has happened to the female taste buds in this studio, I ask myself. Right, thank you very much indeed to all of you. We'll have you all back very, very soon. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to turn our attention to the Louise Casey report. The Metropolitan Police is broken and rotten, suffering collapsing public trust, and is guilty of institutional racism, misogyny and homophobia. That's what her report says. But I want to take a slightly different look, because I've heard callers all day on LBC explaining why they've lost trust in the police. And we've done this on the show many times over the past few months. But I think there is another side to the argument here, because there are some terrible things that have happened in the Met, but there are also some brilliant things that happen in our police forces up and down the country. So I want to hear your experiences, good and bad. So we're going to have a bit of a balanced phone-in, I hope, over the next 60 minutes.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, Labour is accusing the Home Secretary of a dangerously complacent response to a review which found the Metropolitan Police Service to be institutionally racist, sexist and homophobic. Suella